Hello 9A4, this is your second lesson on Act 3 of The Crucible. Can you put today's date, which is Tuesday the 12th of January. Your title is Act 3 The Crucible, Lesson 2. And in your top left hand corner, as you hopefully did yesterday, can you put Mrs. Sheehan, my name, so you know this is one of my lessons and the work you're completing is for that lesson. What I'd first like you to do in just a second is access the quiz that's on the Teams chat, which is acting as our starter for today. But before you do that, just to run through our objectives. Our objectives today are to closely analyse language and the dramatic techniques used within Act 3, and to explore the presentation of some characters within Act 3 as well. So if you can now pause this video, go onto the Teams chat, and you will find there a link to the quizzes quiz about the Crucible and Act 3 specifically. There should be another link as well which just signs you up to be part of a class, in inverted commas, on quizzes. So just try and make sure that you access the right one. Answer the questions, I'll be able to see your answers, and then we'll feed back and continue with the lesson. So pause the video now and access that quiz, please. Okay, so hopefully if you're accessing the virtual lesson, you will have completed the starter quiz through quizzes. If you want, you can also sign up to the class on quizzes, which you've received an invitation to do so. That means that it's just much easier for you to access the content in on there in the future. So just a bit more information, maybe a bit of a recap for some of you about the significance of Act 3 in the play as a whole. So Act 3 takes place chronologically 1 week after the events that we read about in Act 2. Within Act 3, the Crucible as such is brought to a boiling point. So this pot of molten lava, drama, tension boils over. When John confesses about his affair with Abigail, Elizabeth lies to try and save him, and ultimately Abigail loses the affection and the possession of John for good. So it really marks a point where their relationship is completely over with. Act 3 also introduces the workings of the courtroom, and especially its chief magistrate, Governor Danforth. Now he comes across as quite a stern, pig-headed man. He very much believes what he does is right, and he's quite gung-ho in his actions. So he does things not without thinking necessarily, but he doesn't like to consider other people's opinions or evidence, either for or against the actions that he's decided to take. And this act reveals much about the nature of authority in the play and the wider links that it has to theocracy of Salem and the absolute authority of God at the time. So it's really quite revealing about the context of this play and the period of time, the historical context that it has. Sorry. So we're going to look at something now called a logical fallacy. So I'd like you to have a quick think. What is a logical fallacy? Now, there's a little image here of they look like hedgehogs, but I think they're supposed to be lemmings that are mindlessly running off a cliff, and they're saying, "What are we doing?" And then one of the lemmings behind them says, "I don't know. I think I heard something about a case study." So really it's trying to show through an image what a logical fallacy is, and what can happen when one occurs. So the lemmings or the hedgehogs represent the fallacy. So a fallacy is something that people mistakenly believe in, something that people mistakenly believe in and believe something is true, even when it's not, or when it's, there's evidence that points to it not being a good idea. So these lemmings are jumping off the cliff. This is the fallacy, and they're mistakenly believing that this is a good thing to do. Okay, so they just willingly do it. That's a fallacy. It's false. You know, it's not a good thing to do, but they're still jumping off the cliff. Logical. Now, we know that the word logical means something that makes sense. We maybe assume something logical, that there's evidence behind it. We assume that if something's logical, it's more than just an opinion or a feeling. We assume that there's some fact behind it. So the reason that this image portrays a logical fallacy is because one of the lemmings shouts, "I don't know, I think I heard something about a case study." Now, the use of the phrase case study makes this fallacy, or these lemmings jumping off the cliff, seem logical, because case study sounds science-ish, doesn't it? So I put here, I mean, it sounds science enough, right? And we hear about people claiming case studies have taken place to try and justify and evidence what they're saying, their opinions, their arguments. I mean, we certainly hear a lot about case studies at the moment with regards to the vaccination for COVID, in the daily briefings from the government, where they have Chris Vitti, the scientist, and they have the mathematicians and the consultants in the NHS. They talk a lot about case studies and evidence-based information that they portray to us. So we know, just through the use of the word case study in the media, that we attribute that phrase to being something that's factual, that something's true, that there's an evidence behind something. So basically, this image is saying a lot of people are questioning why they're doing something, questioning why these lemmings, they are doing the action, of jumping off the cliff, but they continue to do so because one of the lemmings simply says there's a case study. So therefore, the other lemmings assume, well, it must be true. They don't look into it themselves. They just take it as gospel. Well, if there's a case study, we'll do it. Hopefully I've explained it well there. If not, I want us to discuss this anyway in the lesson. So if you're part of that virtual lesson, that is what we're going to be doing. Right. So task 2, a logical fallacy question mark. So I'd like you to put task 2 and a logical fallacy question mark as your title for this section of work. And then from these 5 bullet points, I want you to just make some notes under the heading of a logical fallacy question mark. And it's why in Act 3, the process of the court and the idea of these, as we know it, innocent members of the community being witches or accused of witchcraft is a logical fallacy, and how that comes about. So the first bullet point reads, the link between the court and God was hinted at in Act 2 by Mary's description of the events in court as first the court's work, then weighty work, and then God's work. So there's this escalation of it being something, of importance, of significance, ultimately being called, directly the court's decisions of God's work. We know in the context of the play, these people were Puritans, therefore God was revered, highly respected, and they lived a very pure Christian life. So what God said goes. They didn't want to really deviate from the Bible at all. Like most people in Salem, Judge Danforth sees everything in black and white. Everyone is good or evil, with God or with the devil. So there's no grey area. You're either godly and you follow the rules, or even one slight ungodly manoeuvre and you're considered to be with the devil. The court is divinely sanctioned, therefore belonging to God. So anyone who opposes the court cannot be an honest opponent, because essentially they're opposing God. So for instance, Proctor, Giles or Corey. So anybody that even slightly questions Danforth's authority is directly questioning God, because Danforth's word, the court's word, is gospel, comes from God. In theocracy, you cannot have religious disagreements, as God is infallible. As the court is God, in some senses, anyone who opposes the court is an enemy of God. So as we've just said, in a society of theocracy, there is no room for manoeuvre about questioning the word of God and the message from God. If you do so, you're committing heresy and denouncing God and the church. Therefore, you are evil, you are going to hell, you're quite likely to be executed. This also means that there are no shades of justice, so there's no spectrum of offences. So we know in this country and around the world in a lot of places, you may steal a chocolate bar from a shop, which is obviously still against the law and really not a great thing to be doing, and if you are caught you will absolutely be reprimanded for that. Or you could also, in contrast, you might steal a car, drive it recklessly on the road, possibly risk life or take somebody's life or injure or harm somebody, and obviously you've also taken an incredibly valuable possession, and for that it's much more likely that you would go to prison and have to go to Crown Court, receive a prison sentence and serve time. So there's a spectrum there. Stealing is stealing. The principle of it is the same. However, what you steal is considered on a spectrum. So if it's a chocolate bar, you're likely to be reprimanded. You may receive a small conviction. You might receive a warning, or just a slap on the wrist. You might get banned from a shop. Whereas if you stole a car and joyrode it around town, you are more likely to be very surprised if you didn't receive a prison sentence. And you would have to go through a Crown Court system. So we operate our justice on a scale, whereas in Salem and within the Crucible there is no scale or no different shades of justice. Any sin is the same as each other, so all sins are regarded as ungodly and denouncing the Bible and God's word. So Rebecca is charged with murdering babies and Martha for the death of a pig, but both of these people are sentenced to death. So, Martha's murdered a pig. Well, some might argue we do that all the time when we want bacon or a pork chop. But Rebecca has murdered a baby and she receives the same sentence. And, even in our society, murdering a baby is absolutely horrific and barbaric, and you would expect to receive the most harsh form of justice. However, if you simply killed a pig, it's more unlikely, if not virtually impossible, that you would receive the same level of justice. However, in the time of the Crucible, either murder, both resulted in a death sentence. So make some notes on these 5 bullet points. It should take 5 to 10 minutes, then come back. Okay, so all of these, so the kind of logical fallacy that's created in Act 3 all is underpinned by this illogical equation. So basically the court does God's work. That's what's believed. That is the way it is. But as a result, an enemy of the court, so anybody that disagrees with the court or questions the judgment, must be a servant of the devil. You must not believe in God, therefore you believe in the devil, because there's no grey area, there's no in between. Therefore, you're automatically guilty regardless of what your crime is. So you're going into this court situation with no opportunity of being innocent, basically. So we know, well, there's no opportunity of coming out of it in a good way. So I know when we started looking at the Crucible way back at the beginning of November, end of October, we talked about in this country when they used to accuse women of being witches, they would put them on the dunking stool, and we talked about how it stunts in Mount Fitchett. There was an example of one where they would dunk a alleged witch underwater and then lift her out when she was dead. And basically, if she survived, she was considered a witch, so she would be executed anyway. And if she died, she would be considered not a witch, so she was innocent, but they'd killed her in the process. So basically, that's an illogical equation as well. Either way, you're either guilty or you're going to be murdered. So you're dead either way. You've got no hope of coming out of your trial successfully. So it's incredibly unfair. So the third task, which should only take you about 5 minutes, is to copy any of these keywords that you're unsure of. So we've got antithesis, juxtaposition, infallible, and absolutism. So read through those and their definitions. Any that you don't feel you know off by heart, just copy them down into your book neatly with the word and their definition. And then task 4 is to answer questions 1 and 2. So firstly, think about how Miller creates an atmosphere of fear in the opening of Act 3, up to when the entrance of Giles and Corey occurs. Now for this, you're probably going to want to read through the beginning of the Crucible again, and the Crucible PDF is linked on Go for Schools. So I'd like you to comment on the language used, so the various words that are used by characters, the pace of the reading, any stage directions that Miller has put in there, dialogue between characters, and the characterizations, so how characters are moulded and how that influences how we perceive them as a viewer or as a reader of the play. I would expect you to do around 2 paragraphs for that question. And then just a paragraph, maybe 2, of what are your first impressions of Danforth, and that's question 2. So what are your first impressions of Danforth as the judge? Okay, so that's the lesson for today. Hopefully you attended the virtual lesson, so you've worked through these tasks gradually, fed back to me as we've gone. If not, this lesson has been recorded, or will have been recorded, and it will be accessible on the Teams chat on Microsoft Teams. So you can play the lesson alongside this video if you like, just to see any other thoughts and feedback that was said during the lesson. So I wish you the best of luck and take care.